As someone who gets pitched a lot of documentaries, it's starting to get painfully obvious that 95% of the films aren't working for the same simple reason. And it has nothing to do with gear or LUTs or 120 FPS raw 8K. It's all about a skill that humanity has possessed for thousands of years, yet the vast majority of new doc filmmakers get it wrong, which usually means their films will fall flat. So in this video, we're gonna break down the real reason your documentary isn't working and then go over 3 basic tweaks you can make to the way you approach your documentaries so that they can finally hit their true potential. So first off, when I say that most of the films people pitch me don't work, what exactly do I mean? Because in some ways the quality of docs has never been higher, but it's usually not in the way that really matters. A typical pitch I get will be something like this. Hey Luke, my name is so-and-so, and at some point in my life I had an experience or a hobby or a job that had a big impact on my life. Depending on the person, that might be anything from surfing pipeline in Hawaii to surviving childhood abuse to road tripping from Alaska to Argentina. Then after that, they usually say something like, because of my connection to this issue, I want to tell this story so I can share this powerful experience with others. Then there will probably be a bit more technical information about how the process of making this film would look, like I'll go to Antarctica for 10 days, or I'll embed with hikers on the Pacific Trail for 3 months, or whatever, and then often a list of the gear that will be used to film it. And setting aside for a second that I'm not a production company and I can barely get my own projects off the ground, let alone produce them for other people, there's a fundamental issue with all these pitches that cripples them before they even get started. And it's not that the ideas are bad exactly, because a lot of the time they found super exciting and dramatic subjects, but they're almost always missing the most important thing. Can anyone guess what I'm talking about yet? In case you're still not sure, I won't beat around the bush here. It's that these are not stories. Now, before I get into the 3 principles you can follow to make sure your project doesn't fall into the same trap, let's talk about what a story is and why most pitches I see don't work. We'll get deeper into this stuff as the video goes on, but the root of the whole issue is that these are topics. Stories are journeys with characters, obstacles, and endings, and it's through stories that people connect to a film on an emotional level. Star Wars isn't about the macro level dangers of fascism and empire building. I mean, it is about that as well, but the soul of the thing is about a young farmer who goes on a galaxy-spanning mission to triumph over evil and find enlightenment. The big picture topical stuff and all the philosophical points are also made, but it's the story that makes this movie a classic. And I'm sorry to say, but for 9 out of 10 filmmakers I talk to during mentorship calls, they think they have a story when in reality they have a topic. And telling stories has nothing to do with the scale or the scope of the project either. Going on a 10-year Himalayan expedition is not necessarily a better story than a film about a senior citizen walking up the hill behind their retirement home every day for 15 years. It's just a more dramatic topic. But if the film about the senior tells a real story, while the expedition film is just a bunch of eye candy visuals strung together with an Imagine Dragons song playing in the background, the first project is going to be much, much better. And in case you still think you need a big, huge scope to your work, I just read a 200-page book about oranges, and it was one of the most fascinating things I've read in a while. It's called, surprise, surprise, Oranges, and it's by John McPhee, who, if you don't know him, is one of the greatest nonfiction writers ever, and he's written a bunch of other books on topics like shipping logistics and geology, which he even won a Pulitzer for, and even one that's just about a single game of tennis in the US Open that wasn't even a championship match, and all of them were just as good as Oranges. So before we go any further, just get rid of the idea that your film is going to work because you want to shoot it in the middle of the Sahara Desert or something. A movie like The King of Kong, for example, which is just about 2 guys trying to break video game records, it's super tiny in scope, but because of its storytelling, it's amazing. Yes, there are examples out there of topical documentaries that work, like those massive Ken Burns projects on the Civil War, but that's the exception, not the rule. And even a lot of the things you might think are topical, like BBC Planet Earth, a lot of them really aren't. The reason people love Planet Earth and Blue Planet and all the other spin-offs is because while the overall topic might be the health and interconnectivity of the species on the planet, it's actually made up of dozens of stories. Like, one of those segments isn't about lions. It's about a group of lions starving on the savannah because of a drought as they hunt for a gazelle, and it has life or death consequences. And just as this is going on, the old alpha is being challenged by his son. Those are stories in exactly the same way that Dune is. They just happen to be about something real and on a bit of a different scale. Watch one of those segments again and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, so now that we've established that stories almost always beat topics when it comes to great films, how can we figure out if our projects are actually stories or not? Well, the first and most basic question you can ask yourself is, where is the story's point of view coming from? In order to transform a topic into a real story, the audience needs to experience the story from a specific perspective rather than just learning a bunch of information. And more often than not, that means through a main character or maybe a few main characters. So before you rush out to start shooting B-roll, it's super important to establish who your characters are, because a story without characters won't end up being a story most of the time. And to take it one step further, you also need to figure out what that character wants so that there's something to build towards. Like, if the character doesn't want anything, then there's no way to measure risk or success. If there are any Peter McKinnon fans out there, I remember a video of his from a few years ago where he talked about trying to make a doc about his favorite band and then running out to get a bunch of anamorphic lenses and red cameras and shooting tons of amazing footage. But when he got it into post, it was impossible to shape into a film because it wasn't clear what those characters wanted. And not that I'm following it all that much, but as far as I know, it's still in the edit years later. And that's no diss on Peter, because it's really hard to do, and any filmmaker who doesn't start with a story in mind can run into this problem. By the end of a story, we need to see that character either getting or not getting what they want, and it's this tension of working towards something uncertain that makes a story interesting. If we use the Oscar-winning doc Free Solo as an example, it isn't a story about rock climbing, it's about the journey of one climber trying to be the first person to climb El Cap without ropes. Whether or not he gets what he wants is the whole point of the film, and it's why our palms are sweating the whole time. If you change that movie and instead made it about all the different types of people and all the different ways people have tried to climb that face in history, you might have an interesting historical film, but it's not a story in the same powerful way. I won't say it can't work, but there's a reason Free Solo won an Oscar. Stories make people feel in a way that information doesn't. Now, a character with a goal is pretty much essential, but that alone isn't enough to make a good story great. If you really want to care about this journey and get the audience invested in the outcome, you need to establish more than just what your character wants. And that means stakes. Like, let's imagine Free Solo again, but this time he used ropes. I mean, don't get me wrong, climbing El Cap in any way makes you an elite rock climber, but there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of films about climbing in Yosemite, and none of those went to the Oscars. And yes, the filmmakers did a great job, but a big part of the reason that Free Solo hit so hard was because there were very real and very deadly stakes. If he made one mistake, he was dead, and everyone watching knew that. The crazy stakes ratchet up the tension, and creating tension is what good storytelling is all about. So if you're planning a new project, or maybe you can't quite figure out why the one you're working on doesn't feel very compelling, ask yourself, do you have a character who clearly wants something, and what are the stakes if they don't get it? In Planet Earth, the stakes are that the animal either survives or dies. In Star Wars, it's either they blow up the Death Star or the Empire conquers the universe. Without a character who wants something in stakes, it's gonna be really hard to create tension and suck the audience in. So assuming you do have a character who wants something, even once we've set up the clear stakes, great stories add even more tension by placing obstacles along the way as the characters strive to reach their goals. Think of a graph of your story, and don't worry, we're not going to get too technical and talk about 3-act structures or anything like that, but the story starts on one end and builds slowly towards the ultimate moment of tension where we find out if the character was successful or not. That would be the moment where Alex Honnold finishes the climb and succeeds, or the seal escapes from the whale. But we don't want that to be one smooth, uninterrupted line, because that's sort of predictable and boring. No, instead, a really great story will have a bunch of obstacles along the way, things that make success even more uncertain. The aborted first climb in Free Solo, the tension with his girlfriend who's terrified he'll die, or getting ready to attempt the most difficult move on the wall. These are all obstacles. So as you visualize this graph, imagine little dots along the way where the character will have to overcome things in order to keep going. If you don't have any obstacles, you're giving up tension, which is, again, what almost all great stories are about. Now, if you've got all these elements in your film, you're way ahead of most people, because like I said, most of the time when I'm talking to new filmmakers, this stuff is missing. It's not enough to say I'm making a film about my crazy uncle, or I'm gonna make a movie about my favorite musician. The film has to be about the crazy uncle's search for love before he turns 70. Then we have to see him navigate the world of online dating with all sorts of struggles and embarrassing situations leading up to his 70th birthday when we learn if he finds a partner or not. Filming the band for 3 months is not a story. A story would be, this is a film about a band's dream to sign with X record label or headline a specific show. Then we follow along as they try to make it happen. I hope you can see the difference here, and if you don't at least have some idea of what these beats could be, then you probably don't have a story yet. But still, there's one more thing you really need to figure out if you want to know why your film isn't working, and it's arguably the most important of all. Because while it's great to have a character who wants something and establish stakes and facing all the obstacles in the world, if there's no resolution, then the audience will feel very unsatisfied when the film ends. The resolution is where all of that tension and character building finally pays off in a single moment, and if the ending doesn't deliver, then the story will never be as good as it could be. If the Death Star doesn't blow up, or if Alex Honnold decided to call it off and wait till next year, there's no emotional release. And it doesn't have to be a happy ending either, because obviously with docs you can't control what's gonna happen. Resolutions are so important that if it's at all possible, you're gonna wanna have an idea of what that resolution might be before you even start shooting. I'm not saying you need to know what happens, because in docs we usually don't, but you have to know what the story is building towards. The final result could be either positive or negative, but Jimmy Chin knew that there would be a resolution to Free Solo, just like the makers of King of Kong knew that one of the two competitors would win and one would lose. If there's no way to resolve all the tension, the story doesn't work. Either the seal survives or the whale eats it, but one way or the other, there's a resolution. Now, the internet being what it is, I'm sure there's gonna be lots of comments like, but what about X film? That didn't work this way. And you'd probably be right. There are lots of examples of films that are good that don't have characters or stakes. Films like Manufactured Landscapes or Baraka jump to mind, but those are not the norm. For the vast majority of filmmakers, whether documentary or otherwise, the lack of those important story elements will hold you back. So before you rush out to shoot that next thing, ask yourself, who is my main character and what do they want? Why do they want that thing, and what happens if they don't get it? What challenges will they face along the way? When or how will we know if they achieve their goal or not? I promise that if you hit all these elements, it's going to make your films much, much stronger. And if you need extra help figuring out whether or not your film is working as a story or not, you can always check out the link below to set up a one-on-one call with me, and we'll pick the whole thing apart and get you headed on the right track. But whatever you do, just think stories and not topics, and I think you'll find that your films are working a lot better. See ya.